The nervous system. There are 5 functions of the nervous system. The nervous system receives sensory input or sensory information from the external and internal environment. Next, through integration, all of the sensory information is brought together. Once all the sensory information is integrated or combined, the nervous system interprets what that sensory information means. When all of the sensory information is interpreted or understood, the nervous system can then initiate a motor response or action to that initial sensory input. These functions of the nervous system allow the nervous system to maintain a normal, stable, internal environment, or in other words, maintain homeostasis. The nervous system has 2 major divisions. The first division is the central nervous system. The second division is the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system can be further subdivided into the sensory division and the motor division. And the motor division can be further subdivided into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And finally, the autonomic nervous system can be subdivided into the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. The main cell of the nervous system is the neuron. A neuron is a nerve cell that receives stimuli and transmits action potentials to other neurons or effector organs. There are several parts of a neuron, with each part serving a specific function for that neuron. The first part of the neuron is called the dendrite, and the dendrites are short extensions that receives information from other neurons or sensory receptors. The next part of the neuron is called the cell body. The cell body is the part of the neuron that contains the nucleus and other organelles typically found within a cell. Following the cell body is the axon hillock. The axon hillock is the location where an action potential is created. From the axon hillock, the next part of the neuron is called the axon. The axon is a long extension that conducts and transmits action potentials. Surrounding the axon is a covering called the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath serves as an insulator that prevents electrical current flow across the cell membrane. And between the myelin sheaths are gaps where electrical current flows easily, called the nodes of Ranvier. And the last part of a neuron is the axon terminal. The axon terminal is the end of the axon that synapses with dendrites of adjacent neurons. Next, we discuss how neurons can be classified. One way that neurons can be classified is by the number of extensions coming off of the cell body. In this particular example here, the 3 neurons that you're looking at, in the first picture you have 2 extensions coming off of the cell body. This is what we call a bipolar neuron. In the second image, you see 1 extension coming off of the cell body. This is called a unipolar neuron. And in the final image, you can see that there are many extensions coming off of the cell body, and we would classify this as a multipolar neuron. Another way that neurons can be classified is by their function. Functional classification of neurons is determined by the direction the action potential travels between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And there are 3 functional classifications of neurons. The first functional classification is the motor neuron. The second classification is a sensory neuron, and the third classification is an interneuron. A motor neuron, by definition, is a neuron that transmits an action potential from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system, and it is the neuron responsible for creating a motor response or action. A sensory neuron is a neuron that transmits its action potential from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, and it is the neuron that receives and transmits sensory information. And the last functional classification of a neuron is the interneuron. The interneuron transmits electrical impulses between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. And the last topic of discussion about the neuron are the types of cell membrane transports found on the axon. And there are 3 types of axon membrane transports. The first type of transport is called a voltage-gated ion channel. This is a passive transport. In other words, it allows things or substances to pass through it by the process of diffusion or osmosis. The second type of membrane transport is called a chemical gated ion channel. This too is also a passive transport. And the third type of cell membrane transport is the pump. The pump is an active transport, which means that it requires energy to move substances or materials across the cell membrane. A voltage-gated channel only opens in response to the presence of a voltage, or an action potential. When an action potential arrives down the cell membrane, this channel opens, allowing substances or materials to pass right through it by the means of the process diffusion or osmosis. A chemical gated ion channel opens in response to the presence of a chemical, in this case a neurotransmitter. So when a neurotransmitter binds to a receptor, the channel opens, allowing substances to diffuse across the membrane. And finally, the pump, which requires energy, will transport substances across their concentration gradients to their resting locations.